Hello folks, I feel like it's been a while, so we'll start with a few announcements. We're getting towards the end of the semester, so you'll have just a couple more reading quizzes, a couple more discussion posts over the next couple weeks. Next week we will be doing Paper 2 conferences, so be sure to sign up for those, or email me to set something up by Saturday night, if at all possible, just to allow time for y'all to double check and make sure everything is squared away before we start conferencing on Monday. Paper 2 is going to be due the Monday before Thanksgiving break on Moodle. And really, after that, you'll just have the final exam for this class. I'm not making y'all do any new reading that week, dead week after Halloween, so that y'all can focus on whatever you've got going on. And the final, please don't worry about the final. I will post a whole video explaining it as we get closer to time, but please know that if you've been doing well in the quizzes, and pretty much all of you have, you're going to do fine on the final, so don't stress about that. Okay, we've got a lot to get into this week. We've hopped around a fair bit in time and space with our texts over the last few weeks, but I wanted to chat with y'all a little bit about the different versions of modern witches as we've seen in the last few texts we have watched and mostly watched. And then you're reading Akata Witch this week and next week. So, Kikis Delivery Service and Hocus Pocus are from the late 80s and early 90s, respectively, and they kind of get into pop culture's ideas about witches that were influential when I was growing up, and maybe some of y'all too. Many contemporary authors, creators, and artists working now were also influenced by this era of fantasy and pop culture. Like, remember, Harry Potter came out in 1998. So since we just watched Juju the web series a couple weeks ago, and it's like a direct response to how witches are portrayed in modern fantasy of that generation, I want to spend a little time thinking about it. I do also want to share this quote with you from Moon Ferguson, the creator of Juju the web series, which is on their website. It says, growing up, I watched many shows. My first introduction to the supernatural was the film Teen Witch in 1989. I then fell in love with other movies and shows, such as The Craft, Practical Magic, Buffy, Sabrina, Charmed. Though these shows brought me much excitement, I didn't see myself in the characters. I wanted to experience supernatural beings who look like me. Blacks and people of color are very underrepresented in the fantasy genre. I think it's time to start writing our stories in the fantasy realm. We are long overdue for black witches, vampires, werewolves, sirens, soothsayers, fauns, etc. We hold an abundance of history which includes magic stemming back to Africa. As we talk about these influential ideas of witchcraft and magic from the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, it's important to think about not just what is being said and portrayed on screen or in the texts, but what isn't being shown or said. Think about, for example, how J.K. Rowling kept trying to go back to retcon her texts to be more inclusive, and how now they were older and starting to look more critically at the text of Harry Potter, a lot of that is deeply questionable, from her famously identifying Dumbledore as gay after the fact, and on Twitter, and just excusing the lack of evidence in the text because it wasn't relevant to Harry's story, to her incredibly stereotypical and borderline racist names for the few diverse characters in the text, to her insistence that the one Irish kid at Hogwarts in Britain is obsessed with blowing things up in the 90s after nearly 30 years of conflict with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Deeply questionable and suspect. Thinking about the texts that we read as sort of examples of this time, as many of you pointed out in your discussion posts, Hocus Pocus is portraying stereotypical witches, old haggish ladies who want to steal the souls of children and make themselves young and beautiful, who are dangerous because of their agency. sexually, economically, interpersonally, right? Between the three of them and their unique skills, they're able to get all the things they need for their craft in 17th century Salem. And by relying on each of their strengths, they make it pretty far in adapting to the modern world in the 90s as well. Growing up, I read and watched a lot of stuff in which witches are the villains. And Hocus Pocus presents the Sanderson sisters in a manner that leans into that in a fun, campy way, without taking itself too seriously, right? But in the end, the witches were able to get along in Salem in the past and in the present of the film because they're reasonably attractive white ladies, and they're led by Winnie, who's not only clever but charismatic and seemingly well educated, which is a privilege for a 17th century lady to be. It's really just the, insistence on sucking the souls out of children that really does them in the end, and that's sort of itself just a spin on centuries of traditions, like aligning witches with the dangers of midwifery and with various medical troubles in communities. So, shifting to think about Kikis delivery service, which is incidentally one of my favorite movies, it showcases a different type of witch. As many of y'all pointed out, Kiki is young, innocent, and generally a kind person who wants to use her magic for good. She's able to regain the use of her powers at the end of the film through concern for others. She also is, throughout the film, obsessed with her appearance and with what other people, especially boys, think of her. And now I know that she's 13, and I know many 13-year-olds, regardless of gender, may be like that, but consider how her preoccupation with her appearance for a date with Tombo leads to her illness and to the diminishing of her powers, and how that problem was only able to be resolved by focusing on herself, her intrinsic inspiration and motivation, rather than being worried about outside shallow things, right? And I mean, at the end, Kiki is able to come into her own, living happily and being herself in the new life that she made in the city. But she does also seem to have this happily ever after with Tombo. So you have the male writers and creators of this film still relying heavily on patriarchal stereotypes of women, especially young women, as shallow and boy crazy. And I mean, that's not to say the film is terrible. Like I said, I love this movie. But it's missing that complexity that comes with showcasing women writers, trans writers, non-binary storytellers. Some 13-year-olds are boy crazy, sure. Some boys like playing with mud and dirt and dogs or whatever, the Andy Griffith show is about. But many you have a different variety of internal crises and concerns that you just don't see much of in mainstream popular stories that, I grew up with and maybe you grew up with. So I want to invite y'all to, keep an eye out not just on what the stories that are influential in your life and in pop culture in general, are saying, but also kind of what they're not showcasing, and kind of, especially in the last 20 years, there has been a big push to kind of diversify the voices that we hear. So keeping that in mind as well. So, with Ekatowicz, which is the last text we'll read together in this course, it's kind of doing the same work that Juju the web series is doing, right? It's inviting us to question and to broaden the mainstream fantasy and pop culture perspectives that we grew up with, and of what it means to be a witch, magic, and fantasy in general. So, do just consider all that. That's kind of a dense video, but we had a lot of ground to cover. And as always, if you have any questions or concerns about Paper 2, anything coming up, just shoot me an email, let me know. I look forward to conferencing with y'all next week, and Next week's video will focus more on Caught a Witch, but I want to give y'all some time to get into it, you know? I hope you enjoy it. I really liked that book. I totally tore through it in like 3 days over the summer, so. Alright. Talk to y'all soon. Have a good one.